coming up to the holiday of Shavuos. Anniversary of the revelation at Sinai. On Wednesday, we'll talk about the content of the revelation. But tonight, I want to talk about the event as an absolutely fundamental event in the whole of the Jewish tradition. That it is so is not a surprise. I think everybody's aware of that. But it has many different dimensions, which is worth to lay out some of them anyway. First of all, a great deal of the Torah tradition is commandments. Well, commandments come from a commander. So if there's doubt in someone's mind that there exists a commander, or if there's a commander who's silent, you can't have a tradition of commandments. The one great revelation of the existence of the commander and the foundation of the commandments was the revelation at Sinai. So without that basis, the tradition has no foundation at all. Then there's another element. So Maimonides lays out in the laws of the fundamentals of Torah. He says, we didn't believe in Moses because of the miracles that he did. That is to say, we didn't believe that God spoke to Moses because of the miracles that he did. In logic, one thing has nothing to do with the other. God could favor a person by accompanying him with various supernatural events without talking to him. The communication of the Torah requires us to believe that God spoke to Moses, and Moses communicated to us God's words. Revelation at Sinai was a demonstration that God speaks to man in general, and even more than that, that God particularly spoke to Moses. In fact, Maimonides describes what happened at Sinai as God speaking to Moses and allowing us to hear. We're overhearing God's conversation with Moses. I'm leaving out now what he says in the guide about words and voice and sound. Okay, but this he does say in the guide. God was speaking to Moses, and we overheard that conversation, which means that we witnessed God speaking to Moses, which means that we don't have to trust anybody for this. We actually observed it. I believe in Moses, I trust in Moses, not because of some clever argument or some intuition or some drug-induced vision. It was an actual witnessing of God speaking to Moses. And then, Maimonides says, since no later prophet had his prophecy witnessed, no one ever heard God speaking to Isaiah or Jeremiah or Joshua or Ezekiel or anybody else. How did all the later prophets get their credibility? And the answer is that in Moses' Torah it says, when a person will come and fulfill certain criteria, I, Moses, am telling you to treat him as a prophet. It means all later prophecy leans on Moses. Because without Moses' instructions to tell me to treat the person as a prophet, I wouldn't treat him as a prophet, no matter what he does. No matter how many miracles he does. Wouldn't matter. So not only is Moses superior, but without the foundation of Moses, all the later prophets have no validity. And this has many important implications, and here's one of them. Imagine a person who comes and says, I'm a prophet. So the Jew people say, well, let's see, Moses had criteria. Are you a scholar? Try me out. Q&A. And he answers the questions correctly, so he's a scholar. Well, are you generally a good person, a person who fulfills the law, and so forth and so on? Try me out. And he is. Well, now, third criterion, do something that's above and beyond the ordinary. Either do a miracle or demonstrate miraculous knowledge that no one else could have. Show that you are connected to supernatural powers. Notice I said connected to. I didn't say possess. And he does that. Okay? At that point, we say, well, Moses told us that such a person is to be treated as a prophet. Please, Sir Prophet, share your prophecy with us. Now, suppose the prophet says, my first message to you is, not everything Moses said is right. Not everything Moses said is up to date. Not everything Moses said is accurate. Well, where does that leave us? You see, my only reason for listening to him is because Moses said so. That he's telling me not to trust Moses. So he's undercutting his own credibility. If I take him seriously, I can't take him seriously. That's A implies not A in logic. If I take him seriously, then I have to doubt Moses. If I doubt Moses, then I can't take him seriously. Did you ever hear of anybody who did that? Or something like that? Somebody who invited a group of Jews to the park and said, you see this pond? Watch. Let's see, I'm just making this up. See this pond? Watch. I'm going to walk on the surface. Isn't that impressive? I don't sink. I just walk on the surface. Oh, really? Man, that's great. Terrific. You're really special. Tell us what you have to say. Well, no more circumcision. Well, you don't have to keep kosher. Well, Moses was for primitive people 1,300 years ago, but nowadays we're much more sophisticated, much more clever. I have a new message for you. In 100 years, they're going to call it a gospel. Right? Can you imagine why Jews weren't impressed? Why the effort of preaching to Jews was a giant failure? Why after 100 years, those who preached this new idea, preaching to Jews, basically died out, and the rest of them were preaching to Romans? Because to a Jew, it's an inherently nonsensical message. You can't tell me that you're a prophet from God, and then tell me that I shouldn't trust Moses' criteria for prophets. Sorry. It's not consistent. So the foundation in the prophecy of Moses is the basis for all later prophecy. It means without Moses as the foundation, nothing later exists. Nothing later can be accepted. So that's two great roles that Revelation at Sinai performs for us. The first is to establish commandments altogether. The second is to verify later prophecy as genuine. But then there's a third element. This event, the Revelation at Sinai, is a very central event in Jewish history. All later Jewish literature makes reference to it. Celebrated one of the holidays of the season, Shavuos. Imagine that in historical terms, there were serious reason to doubt that it really happened. That it was really a myth, a made-up story. If there were such serious reason, then we could always say, I believe, And that's a valuable thing to say, but it would make our message much harder to be convincing, and it could create doubts in our own minds. Again, doubts are not fatal, and a strong-minded person has to learn to live with doubts. That's quite true. But if there is strong reason to believe that that's a real historical event, that strong reason contributes to our understanding and to our trust of the tradition. On my blog, I have a list of 7 great authorities who say that it is a mitzvah to find reason for the things that you believe. And they include the Chovos Levavos and the Shloh and the Marsha and Rav Dessler and several others. So I would say we don't glory in the fact that we believe without reason. We are, it's justified to believe without external reason, and one has to be strong enough to believe without external reason, but there's definitely an extra element which is added, das Tfunis also of the Ramchal, there's an extra element that's added by providing reason when we can provide reason. Rambam, especially in the Mishnah Torah, not only in the guide, but in the Mishnah Torah says so. It was the mitzvah to know that there's a creator. Not to believe, but to know. That he wrote in Hebrew. Yeah.
So is providing reason, I guess, like, not essential? Is it like a good thing to have, but it's not?
It depends on which commentary you read. The Rambam says in the beginning of the Mishnah Torah that it's a mitzvah to know. You don't know without reason. You have belief without reason, but you don't know without reason. So for him, it's a mitzvah, which means you have not fulfilled that mitzvah. At least you haven't fulfilled it in the best possible way. If you don't have reason, you don't have knowledge.
So it is essential.
Well, it's essential for his way of formulating the mitzvah.
Oh.
I'm not saying that he's the only one who has a view on the subject, but everybody that I know is either silent on the issue or says that it is preferable. Everyone agrees to that. And well, for those who happen to know some of the literature, the Chovos Levavos has a wonderful modern translation and summary called the Lev Tov, and he doesn't give a translation of the first Shar Yichud, and he explains it by giving like 22 responses at the beginning of people who say one shouldn't study these philosophical matters. But that's not a challenge to what I'm saying. Their point is, yes, maybe studying these matters could improve your knowledge if you get through it without being damaged by it, if you survive the investigation with your mind intact, with your belief intact, but it might not be worth it because you're in danger. But if you could be guaranteed that you would get through it without succumbing to the danger, none of them says that it isn't an improvement. We don't glory in belief without reason. We accept it, and we are proud of the fact that we're capable of it. But we don't glory in it and refuse to hear reason. No one condemned the Chovos Levavos as out of court, out of place because he tried to give reason. Okay, so now I want to look at this question, whether there's good reason to believe that Sinai is a real historical event, rather than just a myth. We know that ancient religions, ancient cultures, had many myths about their history. They made up many stories about their history. What reason do we have to think that this story was not made up? Now, here's the reason. This story, the story of the revelation at Sinai, is a story with certain features, which I will describe to you. And there isn't a single story in the world with these features that is known to be false. Not one. Every story that has these features is either known to be true or it's hard to figure out. Not a single one is known to be false. If this is the kind of story that people could make up, then we would expect people to make it up. It's a story that has very strong features. Many, many have pointed out that the story of a mass revelation is a much stronger foundation than the story of one person who says, I'm special, God talked to me. There's a famous Hasidic parable about this. The Rabbi dies, 2 sons are each claiming the leadership of the community, and the competition goes on for several months. One day, one of the brothers says to the community, I know that I'm the one who should lead the community because our father of blessed memory came to me last night in a dream and told me that I should be the leader. And one of the Hasidim said to him, if your father wanted you to be the leader, he shouldn't have come to you in a dream. He should have come to us in a dream and told us what we should do. Right? That's what logic says. And we could say to all the other religions of the world, you start with a person who's special, who tells you that he's special, and you trust him, and then he communicates to you what he says the higher powers want you to know. We are the only religion in the world which traces our origin to a public mass revelation. Not one person telling us that he's special, but our witnessing the fact that he's special. We ourselves witness God talking to him. So it's a much better story. Much better story. So then I say, if it's the kind of story you could make up, people should have made it up. Either people should have thought of it on their own, or after our story came into existence, they should have imitated it, because it's the strongest foundation. That's an intuition. There's something special that's going on here. But I have an argument which is a little more detailed than that. And the argument goes like this. As I said, the story has certain features, and there isn't a single known story with those features that's known to be false. Here are the features. This is what I call a national experiential tradition. By the way, this is done in great detail in my book, Reason to Believe. First of all, this story is a national tradition. It's a tradition that's accepted by the whole nation. That is to say, there was a period of time in which it was accepted by the whole nation. In our case, thousands of years. It doesn't have to be that it's accepted forever. It just has to be that for a significant period of time, it was accepted by the nation. That's feature number one. Number two, the story describes a national experience. Not all stories describe national experiences. The vast majority of stories don't even describe national events, let alone national experiences. Let me give you an example of what I mean by a national experience. Let's take war for the loser. In ancient times, the loser lost because his army was defeated, and the victorious army entered his lands and broke down the walls of his cities and took off men, women, and children as slaves and looted the treasury and sometimes burned the cities and so forth and so on. Everyone in the defeated country knew that there was a war. Maybe not in the victorious country, because the battles may have been several hundred miles from home. The army went, the army came back, the army saw it, the army is a minority of the population. But the defeated know very well that there was a war. That's a national experience. Or, for example, a national invention. You have a story that says, such and such a time, so-and-so invented the bow and arrow. And everybody copied it, and there were contests all over the country, and the best archers were the people who went into the army. We won our battles. That could be 300 years ago, but it's something which everybody participated in. Everybody learned to shoot, and only the best ones went into the army, so on and so on. So it's describing something that was a national experience. Or a national pestilence. You know, in 10 years in Europe, 30% of the population died. 30% in 10 years. Everybody knew that was happening. People were dying everywhere. That was it was an international experience. So there are events that are national experiences. The kind of a tradition I'm talking about is a national tradition about a national experience. Then there's one more feature. Not all national experiences are remembered. They're not all noted, put into the history books and so forth and so on. Even when we know the national experience took place. Let's take, for example, a full eclipse. A full eclipse of the sun. That's quite a noteworthy event. Very, very few ancient cultures kept track of them when they took place. And you can understand why. Everybody saw it. Maybe people were frightened, but life went on afterwards just the way it was beforehand. Nothing changed. Agriculture didn't change. Health conditions didn't change. People didn't give birth to two-headed monsters. I mean, nothing changed. Just things went on the way they were before. Okay, so it was momentarily frightening for an hour or so, and then things went on. So fine. We're talking about a national tradition, about a national experience of the kind of event that would be remembered. It would make a mark on the culture. People's attitudes and the development of the national culture would be affected by it. For example, a severe defeat in war either triggers a kind of pacifism, like the Swiss who've been able to stay out of war for hundreds of years by just being neutral. They just don't participate. I'm not saying it was triggered by defeat, but that kind of position. Or vowing to be better at it next time and win rather than lose. Either way, that event of disastrous defeat is going to be part of the known history where people are going to say, we do what we do because of that event, because of that terrible defeat. Or the pride in the technological invention. Every American knows that the telephone was invented in America, and the Russians tried to pretend that they invented it, but the Russians don't believe the Russian government. These are events that you wouldn't expect to forget. Now, you look out throughout history, all over the world, and you find two things. First of all, in the myths that people make, myths that cultures make, religions make, there are no NETs. There's a wonderful book called Bulfinch's Mythology, 780 pages of ancient myths. I went through it page by page. I summarized it in the appendix to my book. There are only two events which are national experiences, and in both cases, Nation A says it happened to Nation B. That's not what I'm calling an NET. An NET is where you say it happened to your ancestors. There's a wonderful case which was brought to my attention 10 years ago by a correspondent. There's a Native American, oh, you're not supposed to say that, indigenous American people, tribe, who believe in a national revelation, God speaking to a whole nation. So he said to me, that's your story. You don't believe it happened to them, do you? So I sent the case around to some people. One of my students did some research. He found out this is their story. There was a nation A, and God, the gods, whoever they were, spoke to nation A, the whole nation, and then the whole nation A died. Every last man, woman, and child died. And the priest of nation B told nation B what happened to nation A. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about it happening to your ancestors. So in all the myths, now myths are stories which we, for whatever reason we have, take for granted aren't true. And I say that you look at the kinds of myths that people made up, they made up myths about men and women and children and old people and young people and strong people and weak people and isolated people and people who trekked and traveled and so forth and so on. They made myths about monsters of various kinds, myths of people who lived a long time and a short time and so forth and so on. if you could make up this kind of story as a myth, then it should have been made up a number of times. We have no such instance. Also, and by the way, a story of this kind, I don't mean a revelation story. I mean a national experiential tradition about a war, or about a technological invention, or about a pestilence, or migration. We should have full stories of that kind. All the stories that about wars and so forth and so on, the stories regarded as genuine stories, as genuine historical events. So we don't have a single example of a story like this that is known to be false. Well, I think that's a tremendously good record, a tremendously good empirical record. Not a single mistake. That says to me that this type of story is very reliable. And the basis of empirical evidence. Notice, this is an accusation that often is raised in this discussion. It should be obvious the way I put it tonight that it doesn't apply. But you can't rely on the Jewish tradition to validate the Jewish tradition. Aren't you just relying that what it says in the Jewish books is true? No, I am not. First of all, I didn't say anything like that. I rely on the Jewish books to tell me what the story says, because it's a Jewish story. But from the fact that the Jewish books say it, doesn't follow that it's true. My evidence that it's true is that when you survey the historical stories of mankind generally, in Borneo, in China, in Chile, in the South Sea Islands, everywhere, when you look at their historical records, you don't find any stories of this kind. So not using the Jewish tradition to validate the Jewish tradition, not assuming anything about the Jewish tradition at all, except that the Jewish books tell me what the story says, so we know what kind of story it is. Now, some people challenged me and said, look, Rabbi, really, not finding mistakes, why does that count? Tell us how many you found that are true. What do I care about the fact that you didn't find any that are false? I'll show you. I think it's an interesting point of logic in general. Suppose I tell you all A's are B's, like all these stories are true. Could I give you good evidence that all A's are B's without showing you a single A that's a B? Not one? Is that possible? Yes, it is possible. And I'll show you how. I have a lake. It's like half a mile by half a mile. Nice sized lake. There are fish in the lake because I find fish eggs. So I know there are fish there. I tell you that every fish in the lake is smaller than 4 inches. How do I know that? I'll tell you how. Because I took a net, and this net has 3-inch holes. And I troll the lake, high and low, north to east, south, north to west, south, north to south, east to west, daytime, nighttime. I trolled the lake repeatedly. I didn't catch a single fish, not one. And there are fish eggs there. Then they're all smaller than 4 inches, aren't they? Because if they had been 4 inches big, I'd have caught some. So I say all the fish are smaller than 4 inches, and I don't have a single small fish, not one. But I know they're all smaller than 4 inches. So it's possible to have good evidence that all A's are B's without finding a single A that's a B. Just a point of logic. Now here, I indicated that by saying people all over the world have myths. There's a myth-making machine. There's a myth-making part of people's cultures. We know that because they made up so many fantastic stories. So I say, if this is the kind of story that could be made up, it should have been made up more than once. It's a very important story. It has very strong foundations. It leads to a strong foundation for your belief system. If it's the kind of story that you could make up, it should have been made up. So the fact that you don't find it is good evidence that it can't be made up. Now, the next complaint that I get is, well, Rabbi, look, you know, this is a game that anyone can play. You made up a category. You just made it up. And then you find that your story is of this category, and you made up the category so that there'll be no holes in it, there'll be no mistakes, no failures, And then you claim that you have evidence for your story, but you just made up the category, So if you craft your categories, then what you get is something that you made up out of whole cloth. You just made it up. And that charge is wrong for two reasons. First of all, a lot of science works this way. Let's see, water boils at 100 degrees centigrade, right?
Yeah.
Well, not on a mountain. Not on a mountain. It'll boil at 90 degrees centigrade or 80 degrees centigrade. Oh, yeah, the little thing called air pressure. It has to be at sea level. Okay, so water boils at sea level at 70 degrees, at 100 degrees. Really? I tried it with salt water, and it didn't work. Oh, yeah, right, it's got to be pure water. Pure water at sea level. Yeah, but I tried it on a rotating disc, and it didn't work. Oh, no, of course, it has to be stationary. We forgot to put that in, right. It has to be stationary. Okay, aren't you just making it up as you go along? Aren't you just crafting it to cut out the ones that aren't right? Aren't you just artificially making up your category? Yeah, and you're discovering a natural law. That's what you're doing. Nobody thinks that's illegitimate. Nobody thinks that it's phony. Nobody thinks it's just making it up. It isn't objective. Sure, you make your category to fit the facts. And when you have a category that has no counterexample, then you've discovered something about the real world, that things in the real world operate according to this category. So the complaint that you made it up, sure, science does that all the time. But more than that, there's very strong motivation for this category. And the motivation works like this. Take a story like this, a national experiential tradition, right? The nation, its story says the nation believed in it, and it describes a national experience, the kind of thing you would expect people to remember. Imagine someone making up that story, inventing it, and trying to convince people that it's true. 600 years ago, all of your ancestors at the same time had such and such an experience, a spectacular cataclysmic experience. You're telling this to people 600 years later. What do you think people in the audience are going to ask you? If this really happened to our ancestors, how come no one remembers it? Hey, you claim it happened. None of us remember it. We have no records of it, no stories about it, no holidays celebrating it, nobody named after it. We have no knowledge of it whatsoever. He's making it up out of whole cloth. The obstacle is going to be that if it really happened the way you say, we should know about it. It should have left a mark in our system, in our culture. If it was the Greeks who fought a terrible war against the people in Crete and disastered Crete, you'd expect Cretans to hate the Greeks and to have animus against the Greeks as a permanent part of their culture. They suffered from them. So the obstacle that someone making it up is going to face is that there's going to be resistance to accepting it. Now, that seems to be obvious. Psychologically, there's going to be resistance. The only question is, how strong will the resistance be? How strong will the resistance be? Here you could have people disagree. Some say, you're going to make up a story like that. Like, for example, go to Los Angeles and tell them 250 years ago there was an earthquake that leveled the whole city and had to be rebuilt from new. 250 years ago, right? I think they're going to say, if that happened 250 years ago, we'd remember it. There'd be people in the cemetery died of the earthquake, There'd be stories about it. There'd be stories about how we recovered, where did the new investments come from, and so forth and so on. It's not the kind of thing, even after 250 years, even in California, right, which probably was saner in earlier times, it's not going to be forgotten. It's too cataclysmic an event. So this is the kind of thing which you can't make up. So now somebody says, well, maybe 2,000 years ago was different. Okay, maybe yes and maybe no, but there's resistance. Now the question is, how strong is the resistance? Well, at this point, I say, let's do a survey. Let's do an open-minded survey. If you find that there are no false stories of this type, that shows you that that shows you that the resistance is very, very strong. If you found 16 stories out of thousands, 16 which fit this description and are known to be false, you say, okay, I agree there was resistance, but that wasn't always effective. Didn't stop every case of making it up. Sometimes they succeeded in making it up. I use the survey to confirm the intuition. And intuition isn't worth a lot, especially intuition about human beings and human behavior. Lots and lots of natural thoughts about human beings turn out to be false. And lots of the theories showing they're false turn out to be false theories. Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics for some of his work on the way people's psychology works, himself made a mistake using a fault that he himself exposed and described. He was guilty of the very same fault in one of the pieces of evidence that he used. So the whole thing is very unstable. At any rate, the empirical survey is supposed to be evidence that the resistance is very strong resistance. So the category isn't just a made-up category. It's a category of thing which we know there's resistance to accepting it if it's false. The question is, how strong does the resistance go? Okay, I'm going to consider one more argument against myself, which has been urged often, and I'll tell you how to answer it, and then I'm happy to discuss it till the end of the hour. Maybe, this is new ideas for you, and I'm going through fairly quickly, but maybe you'll be able to catch, as I say it, where this person goes wrong. Rabbi, you're telling me that this kind of story couldn't be made up? Couldn't be made up? You can't get people to believe it. It's not true. I can easily think of scenarios where this kind of story could come to be believed even though it isn't true. For example, there's a king and he wants to change the history of the people. So he takes his army and he kills all the history teachers and he puts his soldiers in as the history teachers for children, and the history teach them a new history. And they then grow up believing this history. And even if it's a story of your type, a national tradition about a national experience and so forth and so on, once he has control over the education of the children, he can program them to believe whatever he wants. Or the people are having a religious festival and the priests serve them mescaline or peyote or something else to get them into a suggestible state of mind, and then the priests tell them a story and they all go bowing and going for another puff, and their minds are on fire, and the next morning they wake up and they all believe it, right? Or, to be much more realistic, in anthropology there's something called myth formation. It works like this. Let's suppose a real event takes place. A real, of course for them, real means natural, because they don't believe in anything else. A real natural event takes place, which has a big effect on the people, like a big defeat in war, like a volcanic eruption, like a plague of locusts, some big, shocking, frightening event. So they live through it, they witness it, and they talk about it, and they tell their children about it. They tell their children about what happened. But as you go from generation to generation, the story isn't always told exactly right. Sometimes little things are added, sometimes things are subtracted, sometimes things are changed, maybe most often unconsciously. Just you're telling the story, you leave certain things out, in your mind, you're thinking about other things, you make mistakes. Now imagine these mistakes accumulating over 300 years. Little mistakes, generation after generation, can grow into big mistakes by accumulation, so a natural event could turn into a supernatural event or a revelation or any of the other types of national experiential traditions. A small war could turn into a big war. And a technological invention could turn into something else that was created at the time, because the story is not going to be stable. It's going to change from generation to generation. So I can easily see how stories like this could come into existence and be believed and accepted even if they're false. Why do you think, Rabbi, you sound naive. You sound so credible. Why do you think that this couldn't happen? So, I don't know if you noticed, but a word crept into this critic's remarks, which I haven't used until he started to speak, and that was, isn't it possible? Couldn't it have happened, Rabbi? That means, isn't it possible that it happened, Rabbi? Are you telling me it's impossible for this to happen, Rabbi? Oh, well, let's see now. Wait a second. Who was talking about possibility? I didn't talk about possibility. I talked about what we have good evidence to believe. I talked about there being lots of empirical evidence that stories like this are true. I didn't say it was impossible for one to be false. I simply said that there aren't any that are false. So I want to put the response of the critic this way. Are you telling me, when you paint these scenarios, the scenario of the king with the soldiers being the history teachers, or the scenario of the priests with the mescaline, or the scenario of gradual myth formation where stories change and develop gradually over time, are you suggesting these scenarios as possible or probable? Are you arguing that it's possible for an entity to come into existence, a false one? It's possible through scenarios like this? Or are you arguing that it's probable that they can come into existence through a scenario like this? It makes a big difference. Because if you're arguing that it's possible, I give it to you. I give it to you. Possibility is very, very, very broad. Leprechauns are possible also. Leprechauns aren't impossible. We're just convinced they don't exist because there's no reason to think they do in fact exist. That doesn't make them impossible. So if you are claiming that it's possible, I give it to you, but I claim it's not relevant because I'm not trying to show that false stories like they're impossible. I'm just trying to show that they're very, very, very improbable. That's what I'm trying to show. They're very, very improbable, then it's not appropriate to believe that a story like this came into existence through such a scenario because it's very improbable. So what does the critic have to be saying? The critic has to be saying it's probable. Well, then I ask him, you're telling me that a certain thing happened via a certain scenario, probably. So I ask you, tell me, how many times have you observed this scenario producing this kind of result? How many actual examples do you have? 103? 19? 7? 0? You have 0 examples and you say it's probable? Excuse me, if you have 0 examples, it's not probable. That's not probable. You have to have some reasonable number of actual cases for it to claim that it's probable. We have no cases, 0. No known cases of any teas that are false. And by the way, if you'll ask me, how do you know that, Rabbi? Have you studied all of ancient history? I'll tell you, I've had dozens of critics who have combed the literature that I haven't seen and have sent me dozens of counterexamples, and I've answered every one. They're all in the net. So on the basis of those dozens of people who are actively shooting me down, I claim that we have very good reason to think that there aren't such stories out there. So I think the critic is caught in a bind. If he says it's possible, it's true but not relevant, if he says it's probable, that's just wrong. It isn't probable. So I say that we have very good empirical evidence that the story of the revelation of Sinai is a true story. Now, this argument that I've been presenting is called the Kuzari Principle, K-U-Z-A-R-I, based on the famous book of Jewish philosophy, the Kuzari. And I wrote it in several publications before my book came out, book Reason to Believe. And if you Google the Kuzari Principle, my name will come up also, but lots of critics will come up. In fact, there's a fellow who wrote a whole book, 250 pages, against the Kuzari Principle. I answered, it was like 80 pages of his text, page for page, and then things happened. I couldn't continue it, but it's on the web. That particular piece of mine on the web has had 400 hits. People were really worried about his book, and since then, I don't think it has any credibility. So they haven't written to me and said, "But you didn't take care of this, you didn't take care of that." This was just. So I think that we are on very good ground, very safe ground in taking the revelation of Sinai as a real historical event. Now, there are lots and lots of other questions to ask. I don't think this answers all interesting questions. What about the oral tradition? What about transmission? You know, the accuracy of transmission. There are lots of other things to talk about, 100%. When the Torah talks about the patriarchs, which isn't a national event, do we have evidence for those things? And these are good questions, and they all have to be addressed. And they have been addressed by various people. But as I said, in preparation for Shavuot, Sinai is the absolute foundation of the Jewish religion. Without Sinai, there's nothing left to talk about. That's why I felt it was important to explain why there is adequate reason to believe that it's a real historical event. Questions?
What's the basis that now, like in the modern world, that we're able to hold to this principle?
The Kuzari Principle?
Yeah.
Because it says, the Kuzari Principle says that stories of this type are true. And the way you hold on to it is by looking at the evidence, which is my recommendation for how you should hold on to things. Look at the evidence. And the evidence is that not a single story of this type has ever been found to be false. And there are many which are trusted as true. So that's the evidence that this principle is correct. Right? I don't think that's different from verifying many, many, many other things that we believe. We verify it by checking the examples and seeing what the record is.
It's basically like a proven track record that like it's true.
I mean, again, take the example of how water boils, right?
Yeah.
So water boils at 100 degrees centigrade is wrong, and at sea level is wrong, and salt water, pure water is wrong, and moving water is okay. So then there should be motionless. When you've done all of those experiments and when you've eliminated those counterexamples, you then, and then nobody reports any other counterexamples, you have good reason to think that it's true. And you also have good reason to think that if somebody finds another counterexample, you'll be able to cut that off and keep the basis of the which is very important. It still teaches you something important, general, and true. Right? That's how science works. That's how it works all the time. You know, if you have a circular container of water with a circular hole at the bottom, put water in it for several days so it's actually stationary, then remove the hole at the bottom, a small hole. The water will drain out and it will start to rotate as it goes out. Okay? Now if you try this in New York, in Paris, Berlin, in Tokyo, in Hawaii, right, you'll notice the water always rotates counterclockwise. Always rotates counterclockwise. There's some law of nature that water evacuating from such a container spontaneously rotates counterclockwise. Till you try it in Johannesburg. And there it's clockwise. Doggone, those South Africans, you can't trust them. You can't trust them. Wow! There's something in nature that depends upon the equator? Really? North of the equator? South of the equator? Yeah, well, it's the rotation of the Earth that creates the... Okay, right? But you didn't expect that. So you learned something. Fine, that's how science is done. You take a look at your observations. You try to create a rule that fits the data. If the data does, if you find a counterexample, you think again about what the cause might be and try to explain it. Right? So, but when you have a rule like this, and there are no known counterexamples, and you do a survey, a large survey of world literature, and you don't find it, you think, okay, we're onto something.